Hey guys, we are going to do a quick run through on Chapter 34, FDR and the Shadow of War. So this is going to be the process of how the U.S. goes from being very isolationist to entering into World War II. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, to start with, we got to understand America's foreign policy in the 1930s. And we are very isolationist. If you remember, isolationism is the idea that you want to stay out of foreign affairs. You don't want to deal with the international community. You want to withdraw and focus on what's going on in your country. And if you remember, during this time period of the 30s, the United States is going through the Great Depression. So it makes sense that they would want to forget about the world, focus here, focus on rebuilding the economy, and deal with that first before dealing with anybody else. One way you can tell how isolationist we had become in the 1930s, it was one amendment that was floated. It was never passed, but one idea people had is for Congress to declare war, that the United States had to actually be invaded. We could not declare war basically unless it was a defensive war. Now that didn't happen, but shows how much the American people wanted to stay out of global conflicts. The memory of World War I was still fresh in people's minds, and a lot of people thought World War I was a mistake. So during the 1930s, we actually let our military fall into decline. The United States lets the military spending drop by over half. The reason is, if you maintain a large standing army, or large military, you have to pay for it. So that money comes out of taxes. Roosevelt decided during the Great Depression he wanted to spend the government money on job programs and other New Deal programs, and he didn't want to raise taxes on the American people to help keep the military funding at high levels. Basically, you just don't want to raise taxes on people when they're in recession, when they're in the Great Depression. That takes even more money out of the money supply. So government money, instead of going to the military, going to go towards all those alphabet soup of agencies that we've talked about before. A couple laws that were passed that kind of show how isolationist we were the Neutrality Acts of the 1930s. Now you don't need to know each of these acts, like word for word in each year, but I'll go over some quick things about them individually. The Neutrality Act of 1935 was a law passed that said if the president declares there is a conflict, so two countries are at war, the United States will stay completely neutral. We will not support either of them. And the only way to stay totally neutral is we won't trade with either of them. It doesn't matter if one nation is the aggressor and the other nation was the one just being invaded. We won't pick sides. If you remember, that's part of the reason we got pulled into World War I, is we claimed we were neutral, but we were very much supporting the British and our other allies against the other powers. So people don't want to have that happen to them again. So Neutrality Act of 35, once the president claims there's a conflict, we are not going to support either side. Now that act was set to expire in about 6 months. So 6 months come and go, and we have to have a new law. So now they're going to pass Neutrality Act in 1936. What this act is going to say is it's going to, same idea, we're not going to trade anything, any materials at all, with any belligerent country that's fighting, but also we can't give them loans. So now we can't trade with them, also we can't give them money, because remember, you need money during a war to help fund your war efforts. That was set to expire in, I think it was 18 months. So then 18 months go by, and then we need another Neutrality Act. This one will be the Act of 1937. Now this act is a little bit different than the other two. This act actually allows the United States to trade with a country at war, but it cannot be war materials. We can only trade things that wouldn't be useful to a country at war. Say like food or irons, stoves, some kind of consumer good. It's still meant to keep us neutral, but we want to help our economy at the same time. So we could open up trade a little bit, but not enough that could get us into trouble that looks like we're favoring one side over the other. 37 is also different because it introduces this new idea called cash and carry. Now, just because we're going to trade, we didn't want to risk using our boats, because then if our boats are sunk and Americans are on those boats, Americans could be killed, and then the American people could demand revenge or justice. It could pull us into the war against our will. So, if other countries want to trade with us, they have to bring their boats, carry the goods on their boats from the United States, and they have to pay in cash. We will not accept credit or anything else. So the term was cash and carry. You have to carry the goods with your boats, you have to pay cash. So that's going to stick around when we talk about the next Neutrality Act. So just remember that term, cash and carry, for later on. Another example, how we are trying to be more isolationist in the 30s, is the good neighbor policy. FDR decided he doesn't want to take as big of a role in Central and South America. For Latin America, who we've been very involved with in terms of if something happens, we will invade. We've talked about all the things that happened after the Spanish-American War and Cuba. For now on, if there is a revolution in one of these countries, we are going to use diplomacy instead of just sending in the Marines. And this policy actually worked. We stopped sending in the Marines to countries when various, let's say, issues or problems break out. We take our Marines out of Haiti, who had been there for a long time, and we reduce the amount of stress between Latin America and the United States. This makes FDR very popular in Latin America. He has several statues of him built around the world, especially in Latin America, because of the good neighbor policy. This was even put to the ultimate test by Mexico, because in the late 30s, there was an American oil company that basically was nationalized. Mexico came in and said, this is now ours. It was American private property, no more. This is now going to belong to us. Now, normally, or in a different time in American history, that would be grounds for war. The owners of the factory would go straight to Roosevelt and say, you must send in the troops to protect my private property. FDR in this instance said, relax, let's try diplomacy. They talked it out, and within a couple of years, the company got its factory back, no shots fired, no one died. Last example of how America was staying more isolationist during the 30s is the Spanish Civil War breaks out. So Spanish Civil War we'll talk more about in European history next year. But Spanish Civil War is basically a miniature version of World War II, almost like the cartoon before the movie. It's going to involve a fascist dictator in Spain who's going to try to overthrow the democratic republic that was there. Now, we like Spain. We like their system of government. They had democracy. We did not like this fascist dictator, fascist general, Franco, who's leading the revolution. But we don't want to get involved in the Civil War. We want to stay isolationist. Leave the European affairs to Europe. So Franco is going to be supported by his friends, other fascist dictators like Hitler and Mussolini, who we'll talk a lot more about later. And Spain was basically left to fend for themselves. They had some allies with the Soviet Union, interestingly enough, but not a lot of support, and eventually they were defeated. Franco will take over in Spain and then stay in power for a fairly long time. Now, not all Americans sat this one out. There was, interestingly enough, a group of volunteers called the Abraham Lincoln Battalion. These are Americans that just volunteered to go to Spain and help fight against Franco. And it was hundreds of Americans who did this, but unfortunately they were not successful, and the Spanish government fell. But all of that we'll talk more about in European history next year. Let's keep going. Some other dictators in Europe, some World War II VIPs. Now, all of these men we will talk a lot about next year, but just so you have some faces to go with the names, because you need to know roughly who these people are, what countries they're in charge of. You have Joseph Stalin in the top left-hand corner. He is the leader of the Soviet Union. Benito Mussolini in the top right-hand corner, the leader of Italy. Adolf Hitler in the bottom left, he will be the leader of Nazi Germany. and then General Franco in Spain, who we mentioned once before. All those men we're going to spend a lot of time on next year. Now, one of these men we're going to spend more time on than the rest is Hitler. And the reason why is because FDR, as we are getting closer into declaring war in World War II, so when Europe is kind of starting to fall apart, Hitler's the one FDR is the most worried about. He thinks he's the most kind of insatiable, almost unstable with his demands. FDR had him kind of profiled correctly as he wants true world domination. He's not going to be happy with just taking a slightly bigger chunk or slightly increasing his sphere of influence in Europe. So we'll spend a little bit more time talking about Hitler. Now, Hitler kind of grew out of the Treaty of Versailles that ended World War I. So at the end of World War I, as you remember, Germany was not invited to the treaty. They were not allowed to basically negotiate what the terms were going to be. They were just forced to sign it at the end. And as you remember, Treaty of Versailles was very punitive. It was punishing to Germany. They had to sign the war guilt clause. They owned just tons of money in reparations, an unrealistic amount of money in reparations. So Germany felt very cheated. Hitler, who was a soldier in the German army in World War I, especially felt very cheated. Germany was never invaded. He felt like they were winning. They could have won the war, and the politicians sold him out. He's going to try to take over the government the first time in the early 20s. That will be unsuccessful. He'll be thrown into jail. While in jail, he'll write down his manifesto, Mein Kampf, or My Struggle will be the translation. And in it, it is this crazy book. It's not very good writing, but he goes on for hundreds of pages about Germany's place in the world, what it should be. He blames the Jews, he blames the communists, basically making a case for why Germany should return to greatness and what they need to do to make that happen. Kind of laying out a roadmap for what he's going to do once he gets into power as the head of government and tries to achieve of making Germany expand and become very much more powerful and influential than it currently was. But he gets out of jail and he has to basically wait. He tried to take over the government once, it didn't work. German economy actually recovered a little bit. Things got better from 1925 through 1929 for reasons we've discussed before. So he kind of has to bide his time. He has to wait until the economy gets so bad that the government situation is so dangerous and that people are willing to turn away from stable government they had to somebody more extreme like Hitler. And that is going to happen with the Great Depression. Now, the Great Depression, most people think of the United States when they hear that, and the Great Depression was hugely important in the United States. But it doesn't only affect the United States. It is a worldwide depression. And one of the countries hit almost as hard, arguably maybe the second hardest hit in the world, was Germany. Germany's economy just totally tanks during the Great Depression. That's going to cause all kinds of problems. People don't trust the government anymore because the government couldn't fix the issue. So they're willing to turn to something more extreme. Now there's fights in the streets on who that's going to be. Is it going to be Hitler and his new fascist Nazi party? Is it going to be the communists? People are scared that a communist takeover might happen in Germany, like has happened in the Soviet Union when the economy got bad enough. So a lot of the middle class support is going to go towards the fascists, Hitler's party. Because if you have something to lose, you don't want the communists to take over and take away all your private property and give that away. So Hitler will get a lot of the support from the middle class. He will come into power in 1933 through a kind of complicated but quasi-legal process that we'll spend a lot of time on later. Once he's in power, he starts implementing his laws that he wants to do. Nuremberg laws, first big example of a crackdown on the Jews. So this passes a law saying that the Jews can no longer be German citizens. Jews cannot marry Germans. All kinds of penalties on what jobs Jews can have and what they can't have. Really cracking down on the Jewish community as he made them the scapegoat. He blames the Jews for the position Germany was in. Also, while he's doing that and kind of starting to implement his policies, he's going to form an alliance. He needs a friend. If Hitler has a goal of worldwide domination one day, he can't do that alone. So he's going to reach out to Benito Mussolini, the inventor of fascism, who, as you remember, is the leader now in Italy. Mussolini took over in the 20s, so he's been in power for a while now. He sees with Mussolini someone that shares his ambition, someone who's very militaristic, who wants to expand, and who he thinks he could get along with. So Hitler forms the Rome-Berlin Axis in 1936, and now that he has that, he feels more kind of capable, more secure that he can go ahead and start taking more territory, expanding this new German Reich that he is creating. So his first big test of this is going to be going into the Rhineland. As you can see on this map, the Rhineland was a part of Germany, still is part of Germany, but because of the Treaty of Versailles, it was basically demilitarized. The Rhineland borders France. France is very nervous about Germany going through the Rhineland once again to attack them. The Rhineland is very industrial. There's a lot of raw materials there, a lot of industry. So the Treaty of Versailles said no military can be in the Rhineland. It can only be used for industry. It can't develop past a certain point. And if the military were to go in there, if Hitler were to break these rules, there would be consequences. France, Great Britain, the whole League of Nations perhaps, would come in to stop Hitler. Well, Hitler's going to test this. In 1936, he rearms the Rhineland. He's going to march his military in there. He sits back and waits to see what the international response was going to be. Is France going to send troops against him? Is England? Nothing happened. There were some angry telegrams sent, some angry letters, but the West basically backed down. The Western countries of England, France, were similar to the United States. They were also more isolationist. They had reduced their military spending after World War I. Their countries were much more devastated by World War I than the United States was. So they were focusing just on rebuilding. They don't want another war. The last war took out an entire generation of men. They don't want to see that happen again. So basically, Hitler takes his first big action of expansion into the Rhineland, and he realizes the West isn't going to do anything. If he goes and takes something, the West will not respond. So let's talk a little bit more about Mussolini, just super briefly. As I said, he's the one who actually invents fascism. Like Hitler, he was a soldier in World War I, was disillusioned with government when he came home because Italy should have gotten more territory they were promised, but they didn't in the Treaty of Versailles, basically laughed at and shut out of all the power meetings. So Mussolini kind of creates this nationalistic idea that Italy should once again go back to greatness, go back to when they were like the Roman Empire that covered most of the world. Italy needs to be stronger. So when he comes into power in 1922, he's going to start a huge program of militaristic expansion, spending more money on the military, reducing the unemployment rate, and fixing the economy that was very bad in Italy in the 1920s. His first big test is going to be Ethiopia. He wants to spread out the same way Hitler does, take more territory for Italy, get more raw materials. He doesn't want to start out, though, against a difficult opponent. He doesn't want to start out fighting against France or someone with a large military, a large modern military that could fight back. He instead wants to go fight in Africa. Ethiopia is his first target. Mussolini's goal is Italy to basically turn the Mediterranean into a large Italian lake. He wants to dominate North Africa, take big chunks in the Middle East. Ethiopia is a gateway into the Middle East. If he can go in and take over Ethiopia, he can expand from there north into the Middle East area. He will attack Ethiopia. Ethiopia is not prepared to deal with this new army, this new military that Mussolini has created, and in just a few weeks he has taken over the country. Kind of like Hitler, this is where the international community, you would think, would respond. the League of Nations, their only job is to stop this. This has been the first act of big violence since the Treaty of Versailles was signed, so we've had a peace that's lasted for a while. You would expect someone to step up and say, Mussolini, you can't do this, you can't attack Ethiopia, but no one did. Again, angry letters, but no action was taken. So Mussolini basically gets the message, I can keep going. The West will not stand up to me. The international community will not stand up to me. Stalin, as we said, he is the leader of the Soviet Union. He comes into power when Lenin dies in 1924. Through a crazy series of events, he will kick everyone, all of his rivals, out of the Communist Party, kill most of them. Stalin's just a big fan. If you have a problem, kill it. By 27, he's expelled his rivals. That's when he begins the purges, purging his own people with the peasants and the kulaks, purging his own party of any rivals, purging the military of potential rivals. He's going to kill millions of people. But once he's in power, he does implement these 5-year plans, which would be, in these 5 years, we are going to produce this many tons of steel, or this many tons of iron. He is very interested in industrializing the Soviet Union, because if they become a more industrial nation, and not just an agrarian nation, then they will have a strong military and be able to fight other countries better. So that's his goal. And by the time World War II breaks out, he actually has industrialized the Soviet Union to a huge extent. He's made them much stronger than they were in World War I. Japan, also involved now. Now, for America, the main theater of the war will be the Pacific theater, not necessarily the European theater. We're fighting in both. We're also fighting in Africa. But for this year, for our class, we're going to focus a lot on the Pacific theater. And our main enemy in that theater is the Empire of Japan. Japan, similar story to the others. They, after the Treaty of Versailles, were on the winning side. They expected to increase their land, increase their influence, but they were basically shut out, much like Italy. So they realized the message is the only way to get respect is to be strong, is to take what you want. So when they come home from Versailles, they start a program of building up their military, becoming more fascist to a certain extent. They want to expand their sphere of influence and not be limited anymore to just their home islands. They're going to leave the League of Nations in 1935, and they're going to start invading tons of people. In 30, they already had Korea. In 31, they invade Manchuria. 33, northern China. By 1937, they invade kind of more mainland northern China. And we'll talk about what all of that means for us and our involvement with the Japanese later on. One incident that shows their kind of growing ambitions, in 1937, they shoot on a U.S. ship called the Panay. Now, back in the day, in another time, that would mean we would declare war. Think of like the Maine before the Spanish-American War. But Japan quickly apologizes for shooting this American ship, and then America, once Japan pays us some money and the apology, we accept it and keep going. Remember, America wants to be isolationist. We are not looking for fights. We want to stay out of this war. Japan is also how they tie in with Italy and Germany. Besides their ambitions of expanding their sphere of influence and taking more control of what's going on, they're going to sign a formal agreement with them in 1940. So the Tripartite Pact, difficult to say, but it's got tri in there, so you know it's going to be a triangle. This is going to be a three-way defensive pact between Japan, Italy, and Germany. Basically a defensive military treaty. If any of them are attacked or someone declares war on one of those, the other two will declare war on that other nation. So it gives Japan some cover. Signing up with Germany's very powerful military they had by 1940, and Italy's very powerful military. So we have now a new alliance, a new kind of Axis powers that are going to be a very formidable force in World War II. Let's keep going a little bit more for today, then we'll call it a break. So, an important concept to understand is appeasement. Appeasement is this diplomatic process of you want to avoid war, so you're willing to compromise. You're willing to give in something that you shouldn't give up just to make the other country happy. The goal being ultimately avoid war. Appeasement is going to be very important for World War II. Hitler wants to take more territory. Great Britain's prime minister at the time is a guy named Neville Chamberlain. He is the one in the far left in that picture. Hitler basically says, I want to take the Sudetenland. This is a region in Czechoslovakia that was largely German. It was taken away from Germany in the Treaty of Versailles. So Hitler says, I want to take this, expand it. This should be part of our Reich. These are German people. They should come in. So Neville Chamberlain is flown to Germany. He has a meeting with Hitler. It's actually the only time that Hitler had a sit-down meeting with an Allied leader during the war. And Chamberlain has this choice. He thinks diplomacy, if he can just make Hitler happy, if he can appease him, then maybe he can stop any conflict. Diplomacy, he's hoping, will save Great Britain. So Chamberlain sits down with Hitler. He thinks he has a read on him. Hitler swears that he won't take any more territory. He is done expanding once he gets the Sudetenland. Chamberlain, unfortunately, read him wrong. He agrees. He says, fine, you can take it. We won't stand in your way. And Hitler goes and does that. Now, looking back in hindsight, clearly that was the wrong decision. Hitler couldn't be trusted. He lied. He will, within 6 months, go and take more of Czechoslovakia. He was not satisfied just with the Sudetenland. But Chamberlain thought he was doing the right thing. As Prime Minister at the time, he thought this is what's going to secure peace for the British Empire. We're not going to slip into another World War I. We're done. This is going to protect our soldiers. Unfortunately, he was wrong, and Hitler couldn't be trusted. Here's a quick map, kind of going over what we were talking about, showing Germany's expansion in the beginning. Now, we said how we started with the Rhineland, that region of Germany between them and France and Belgium and the Netherlands. He also expands into Austria. Austria, as you know, was actually Hitler's country of birth, so he wanted to bring them into the German Reich, and there you can see the Sudetenland, that part of Czechoslovakia, basically the western half of Czechoslovakia, he will expand into as well. And you'll notice now the neighbor to the east of Germany, Poland, is probably getting a little nervous, as they should be. Another thing Hitler does right around this time period is Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. Again, Hitler's big scapegoat was the Jews, and this will be another huge, horrible night of violence towards the Jews. It was caused by a Jew in Paris. So I believe he was a Polish-born German Jew. He lived in Germany for a period of time. He ends up in France. He decides he can't deal with what Hitler is doing to the Jewish population within Germany's expanding borders. And he wants to do something to get out his message that that is the wrong thing to do. He goes into the German embassy there in Paris. He demands to speak with somebody. Unfortunately, the German ambassador in Paris was actually not a big fan of Hitler. He didn't agree with this anti-Jewish bend he was on. He was actually under investigation by Hitler's secret police to see how reliable he was. But he walks into this meeting with this young boy, and the young boy pulls out a pistol and shoots him. Kills the German official. The boy is arrested. Doesn't even try to really run or flee. But Hitler now has a reason. He says, look what the Jews are trying to do. They're trying to kill us. They're standing in the way of our progress. We have to come down hard on them. So Kristallnacht, he will basically allow violence towards Jews, both from the state. The state will round up Jews and throw them in concentration camps, or let regular German citizens go out and attack Jewish businesses, Jewish synagogues, breaking all their windows. That's why the broken glass comes from. But thousands of Jewish businesses and homes were burned, synagogues were burned, hundreds were murdered. It was a truly horrible time there in 1938. Now, people are getting increasingly nervous about Hitler. He's clearly not the most stable person out there. He's trying to expand. But at least there's one thing he was scared of, and that was Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union. Stalin has already at this point, by the late 30s, murdered millions of people. He shows no regard for the safety of his own people, and Hitler finds that very troubling. If Stalin was a military opponent, he would have no problem sacrificing countless numbers of his own soldiers against Hitler. So Hitler decides, I need to try to neutralize this threat of Joseph Stalin. If you remember back in World War I, Germany's best chance to win that war was once Russia was neutralized, once they were taken out of the war and Germany didn't have to fight a two-front war anymore. They could focus all their attention on the West. So Hitler decides before this war starts, if there's going to be another war as he keeps expanding, he wants to neutralize Stalin. So he's going to reach out to Stalin and they will sign a non-aggression pact. Basically means we're not going to fight each other. They also had secret arrangements in there for how they're going to split Poland. Hitler will take the western half, Stalin can take the eastern half, and then they'll be set. They'll have this nice border. Hitler can then focus all his attention on the west of Europe, where he will next go into France and deal with Great Britain, and not have to worry about Stalin. This was bad news for the West, because the West was counting on Stalin as his counterweight to kind of keep Hitler more in control. And no one thought they could coexist, Stalin as a communist leader, Hitler as a fascist leader. These two ideologies can't blend together. So when this treaty was signed, it comes as a horrible shock to the West, who was hoping this would be this one control on Hitler we had. And it's even worse news for Poland, because now Hitler basically has the green light. He doesn't have to worry about Stalin. He's not scared of anything else. So he is going to attack Poland. So on September 1st, 1939, Hitler will take about 1 million of his soldiers and invade Poland. He claims the Polish invaded Germany and shot at them first. None of that was true. Poland is quickly overwhelmed. They try to fight back valiantly, but they don't have the technology, the supplies, the numbers. And to make things even worse, Stalin will invade from the other half within a couple weeks, so Poland will fall. The method of warfare that Hitler uses is called blitzkrieg, or lightning war, which basically means completely overwhelm your enemy. Use very quick units, so airplanes, tanks, jeeps, mobile units. You're avoiding the trench warfare of World War I. You quickly punch a hole through the enemy, then you completely overwhelm their central system. It'd be like a virus attacking your central nervous system. All your limbs are fine, but if they can't communicate with your heart or your brain, then it's trouble. Hitler invades a nation, quickly overwhelm the capital, overwhelm where everything's going from, and the rest of the defenses will fall apart. And it's extremely effective in confined spaces. We'll talk about a few times it doesn't work later on when we get into the war itself. Now, because Poland was invaded, Britain and France will go ahead and declare war on Germany. So it looks like, for the Polish perspective, oh, this is horrible news. Germany's declared war on us. But it looks like France and Britain will come to our aid. Maybe we'll be okay. That's the official start of World War II. Unfortunately for Poland, even though France and Britain do declare war, they don't actually take any action to help Poland. They weren't ready to. Their armies were small. They hadn't been funding them. They weren't in any position to take on Hitler in 1939. So Poland, much like Czechoslovakia, is kind of sacrificed. But at least war has been declared, and now things kind of get started. For the next few months, there's not a lot of activity, but the war has officially now begun. That's probably a decent stopping point for today. We'll pick up here and maybe finish off the slideshow next time.